The foreman said she owed him a debt she could not pay. The trail boss said the debt was settled. The debt was not real. The debt was a fiction, constructed by a man named Guthrie Spence, who was the foreman of the Anchor Ranch outside of Caldwell, Kansas, and who had the particular talent for cruelty that some men develop in positions of small authority. The talent for making the people beneath them believe that the authority is larger than it is, that the rules are more binding than they are, that the consequences of disobedience are more severe than they are, and the believing is the trap, because a person who believes in a false authority is as trapped as a person bound by a real one. The woman's name was Sylvie Moran. She was 28 years old, and she had been working as a cook at the Anchor Ranch for 4 months, since May, when she had arrived in Caldwell from Wichita with no money and a reputation for making biscuits that were, according to every cowhand who had eaten them, the best biscuits in southern Kansas, which is a distinction that matters in cattle country because cattle country runs on biscuits the way cities run on coal, and a cook who makes good biscuits is a cook who is valued. And the valuing should have been protection but was not, because Guthrie Spence did not value Sylvie Moran for her biscuits. Guthrie Spence valued Sylvie Moran for her isolation, because an isolated woman is a woman without allies, and a woman without allies is a woman who can be controlled. She had come to Caldwell because Caldwell was the end of the trail, the place where herds arrived and money changed hands, and towns grew up around the changing of hands, the way moss grows on the shaded side of a stone. The town had saloons and hotels and boarding houses and a cattle exchange, and the particular energy of a place that exists because of commerce. And commerce requires food, and food requires cooks, and cooks who can make good biscuits can find work in a town like Caldwell. And finding work was the thing Sylvie needed, because work was the only protection she had. And protection was necessary, because she was a woman alone in cattle country. And women alone in cattle country are either protected by work or vulnerable to everything that work protects against. She had cooked since she was 16, boarding houses, hotels, a restaurant in Dodge City that closed when the owner drank the profits. Each closing sent her to the next town with references and the certainty that she could work, and the certainty was justified by her biscuits, which were light and golden, and which were, in a landscape of biscuits that served primarily as building material, an act of grace. The debt was constructed in pieces, the way a fence is built, one post at a time, each post looking reasonable on its own, the fence only becoming visible when enough posts have been set to connect. The first post was the advance on wages. Guthrie had offered Sylvie 2 months' pay in advance when she arrived, and the offering had seemed generous, but was actually strategic, because an advance creates an obligation, and an obligation creates a lever, and a lever is the tool of men who cannot lead, and so must compel. The second post was the room and board. Guthrie added the cost of Sylvie's room and meals to the debt, a cost he had not mentioned when he hired her, a cost that appeared in the ledger he kept in his office, like a tumor appearing on a body, silently, without announcement, growing. The third post was the breakage, a plate cracked in the washing, a sack of flour that spilled, a skillet handle that snapped, each item added to the ledger at prices that bore no relationship to the actual value of the items, so that a cracked plate became $2, and a spilled sack of flour became $5, and the ledger grew, and the debt grew, and the growing was the point. Because the debt was not intended to be paid, the debt was intended to be owed, permanently, because a permanent debt is a permanent chain, and Guthrie Spence wanted Sylvie Moran chained to the Anchor Ranch because the chaining gave him power, and power was the thing Guthrie Spence needed the way other men need air. Sylvie understood. She understood slowly, the way people understand traps, not all at once but in stages. Each stage a small recognition that the kindness was not kindness, that the advance was not generosity, that the ledger was not accounting but architecture, and the architecture was a cage, and she was inside it. She understood, but she could not leave, because leaving with a debt outstanding was, according to Guthrie, theft, and theft in cattle country was a serious accusation, and the seriousness of the accusation was the final post in the fence. The post that completed the enclosure, The post that said, "You cannot leave because leaving makes you a criminal. And being a criminal in Caldwell, Kansas, means the law. And the law in Caldwell answers to the ranchers. And the ranchers answer to their foreman. And the foreman is me." The trail boss arrived in September. His name was Everett Coyle. He was 40 years old, and he had been driving cattle up the Chisholm Trail for 12 years. And he was bringing a herd of 800 head from the Brazos to the railhead at Caldwell. And the bringing had taken 9 weeks. And the 9 weeks had been long and dusty and hot. And the arrival at Caldwell was the end of the drive. And the end of the drive meant payment and rest and food that was not cooked over a campfire by a man whose primary qualification was that he owned a skillet. Everett Coyle was not a large man. He was medium in every dimension. Medium height, medium build, medium coloring. The kind of man who disappears in a crowd and who reappears only when he speaks. And when he spoke, the speaking had a quality that made people listen. Not because the voice was loud, but because the voice was precise. Each word chosen with the care of a man who has learned that words spoken on a trail drive carry weight. Because on a trail drive, a misunderstood word can mean a stampede, and a stampede can mean death, and death is the consequence that makes a man careful with his vocabulary. He ate supper at the Anchor Ranch on a Tuesday evening in September, because the Anchor offered meals to visiting trail crews at a price that was reasonable, and because the biscuits were, as advertised, the best in southern Kansas, and because eating at the Anchor meant eating at a table instead of on the ground, and a table after 9 weeks of ground was a luxury that justified any price. Sylvie served the meal. She served it the way she served every meal, efficiently, silently, with the downcast quality of a woman who has learned that visibility attracts attention, and attention from Guthrie Spence is not a thing anyone wants. Everett noticed the silence. He noticed it because silence in a cook is unusual. Cooks in cattle country are talkers, the way barbers are talkers, because the kitchen is a social space, and the social space produces conversation, and conversation is the ambient sound of a well-run outfit, and the absence of conversation is a signal, the way the absence of birdsong in a forest is a signal, and the signal says something is wrong. He noticed more over the next 2 days, because the trail crew stayed at Caldwell for 3 days to rest the horses and settle accounts, and because Everett ate at the Anchor each evening, and because each evening he watched Sylvie serve the meals, and each evening the watching showed him more. He saw Guthrie speak to Sylvie in the particular tone, the tone that is too quiet for the room to hear but loud enough for the person it is directed at to flinch, and the flinch was small but visible, the way a horse flinches at a fly, involuntary and revealing. He saw the ledger. He did not read the ledger. It was on Guthrie's desk, visible through the office door, but he saw Guthrie point to it when he spoke to Sylvie, and the pointing was the gesture of a man who is using a document as a weapon, and documents used as weapons are never honest documents. On the 3rd evening, Everett stayed after supper. He stayed while the other men left, and while Sylvie cleared the plates, and while Guthrie sat in his office with the door open and the ledger on the desk. Everett sat at the table and he drank his coffee and he waited, because waiting is a trail boss's primary skill, waiting for weather to clear, waiting for rivers to drop, waiting for cattle to calm. And the waiting is not passive, the waiting is assessment, and the assessment was complete. He spoke to Sylvie in the kitchen. He spoke quietly, the way he spoke to horses that were afraid, without sudden movements, without urgency, with the patient understanding that a frightened creature needs time to decide whether the person speaking is a threat or an ally. "How much does he say you owe?" Sylvie looked at the office door. The door was open. Guthrie was not visible, but his presence was, the way the presence of a person in the next room changes the temperature of the room you are in. $47, Sylvie said. "But I have worked 4 months. The wages should have paid the advance." He adds things. Breakage, room, board. Things he did not mention when I came. "Do you have a contract?" "I have nothing written." He said the arrangement was understood. Understood by whom? By him. Everett set his coffee cup on the counter. He walked to the office. He walked the way he walked toward everything. Directly, without hesitation, the way a man walks when the walking has already been decided, and the decision is final. "Guthrie Spence," Everett said. Guthrie looked up from the ledger. He looked up with the expression of a man who is accustomed to being deferred to, and who is not being deferred to now. And the not being deferred to was a new experience, and the newness of it showed. "The cook," Everett said. "How much does she owe?" "That is between me and my employee." "She is not your employee. An employee is a person who works for agreed wages under agreed terms. The terms were not agreed. They were imposed. The wages were not paid. They were absorbed. The debt was not incurred. It was manufactured. I have driven cattle for 12 years, and I have seen this arrangement on every ranch between the Brazos and the Platte, and it is not employment. It is confinement." Guthrie stood up. The standing was meant to be intimidating. Guthrie was tall and broad, and the standing was the physical assertion of size, the assertion that says, "I am larger, and therefore I am right." But physical assertions work only on people who believe that size determines rightness. And Everett Coyle did not believe that, because Everett Coyle had spent 12 years managing animals that weighed 1,000 pounds each, and the managing had taught him that size is irrelevant. What matters is position, and his position was between Guthrie and the kitchen, and the position was the point. "She owes $47, Guthrie said. "She owes nothing, but I will pay the $47, because paying it will remove your claim, and removing your claim will end this conversation, and ending this conversation will allow me to walk out of this office with the cook, and the cook will not come back, and the not coming back is the settlement." Everett took $47 from his vest pocket. He counted it onto the desk, bills and coins, the trail drive wages he had earned over 9 weeks, the payment for 800 head delivered to the Caldwell railhead, and the counting was deliberate and slow, and the slowness was not hesitation, but ceremony, the ceremony of a man who is making a point with money, the way other men make points with fists. And the point was, this is what your power costs, and it is less than you think. Guthrie took the money because refusing the money would have meant admitting that the money was not the point, and admitting that the money was not the point would have meant admitting that the point was power, and admitting that in front of a trail boss who had just named the power for what it was would have made him small, and smallness was the thing Guthrie Spence had spent his entire life constructing the foreman's authority to avoid. The transaction was complete. Everett turned from the desk and walked to the kitchen door, and Guthrie did not follow, because following would have required a confrontation, and Guthrie Spence did not confront men who were right. Guthrie Spence confronted only people who were weaker, and weakness was the criterion for all of Guthrie's courage, and Everett Coyle was not weak, and the not being weak was the wall that Guthrie's courage could not climb. In the kitchen, Sylvie was standing at the counter. She was standing still, the way people stand still when they have heard something from the next room that changes everything, the way a person stands when the ground shifts beneath them, and the standing still is the body's way of finding the new level before attempting to move. "The debt is paid," Everett said. "You are free to leave." "You paid $47. I paid $47 to settle a debt you did not owe, because settling it was faster than proving it was false. And speed matters, because the longer you stay in this kitchen, the longer you believe his ledger. And his ledger is a lie. And lies believed for too long become truths in the mind of the person who believes them. And I did not want that to happen to you." Sylvie left. She left with Everett Coyle, walking out of the Anchor Ranch kitchen into the September evening with nothing except the clothes she wore and the knowledge that the debt was paid, and the paying was done by a man who had listened to her silence and heard what the silence was saying. And what the silence was saying was help. And the help had arrived not as rescue, but as settlement. The quiet, precise, financial settlement of a debt that was never real, paid by a man who understood that paying a false debt is sometimes the fastest way to prove it was false. They walked to the trail camp outside town. The camp was nearly broken. The crew was leaving in the morning, heading south with empty saddles and full pockets. And Everett made coffee and poured 2 cups, and the 2 cups were the beginning, not the end. Because beginnings do not require drama. Beginnings require coffee and quiet and the particular tenderness of a man who has just spent $47 to settle a debt a woman did not owe. And the spending was not generosity. It was justice. And justice served with coffee at a trail camp in September is as close to love as any first evening can be. They sat by the fire while the stars came out. The Kansas sky in September is wide and clear, and beneath the stars the two of them sat with their coffee, and the fire between them, and the silence between them, and the silence was not the silence of the Anchor kitchen, which was the silence of fear. This silence was the silence of two people who have been through something together and who are resting on the other side of it, the way travelers rest on the far bank of a river after the crossing. "Where will you go?" Everett asked. "I do not know. I will find a kitchen. I always find a kitchen. There is a ranch in the Brazos country that needs a cook. The owner is a woman named Ida Gentry, who runs the outfit herself, and who does not keep ledgers of false debts, and who pays on time and in full. I have driven her cattle for 4 years, and her word is the best currency south of the Red River. And you? I will drive cattle south in the morning. I will be back on the Brazos in 6 weeks. If you are at the Gentry Ranch when I return, I will eat your biscuits and drink your coffee, and sit at your table, and the sitting will not be a transaction. The sitting will be a visit, and a visit is a thing that is given freely, and freely is the only way I know how to give anything." Sylvie looked at the fire. She looked at the stars. She looked at the man who had paid $47 to settle a false debt, and who was now offering her a real job at a real ranch owned by a real woman. And the offering was a door, and a door is different from a cage, because a door opens from both sides, and the difference is the difference between freedom and captivity, and freedom at $47 is a bargain.